So I'm not sure if we can entertain you the way that video did, but we'll sure try. So thank you for coming this morning. I wanted to start with Gabriel Vargas here, since he's the big dog in terms of pharma and biotech. We hear the phrase beyond the pill a lot, and I think in your case it's beyond the molecule. So how much of that is coming from a genuine recognition of the power of digital health and digital therapeutics, and how much of that is paying lip service to the latest fad?
So at Amgen, I think we're relatively new to the digital health space. I was asked about 2 years ago to start up an initiative in the clinical trial space to bring digital applications, digital approaches into our clinical trial development. So for the development of drugs, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And there's been a lot of interest at Amgen and across biotech and pharma of how to integrate digital health approaches. And I think there's a recognition that this is the way of the future, that there's no way around not using digital health approaches. So I think it's more than lip service. I think the challenge currently is how do you go about doing that? How do you actually integrate these approaches into our clinical trial development? I think from our perspective, we strongly believe in this idea of beyond the molecule. The thought being that in the future, and the future being not that far in the future, in the next 5 to 10 years, it'll be pretty standard to be selling drugs with digital health applications. And I think there are 3 major components the way from my perspective. So there are going to be components that are going to be helpful for the patient managing their disease, and these are what we call disease management apps. So these are apps that will be sold along with the molecule to manage your disease. So you can imagine in a disease like migraine, which is one of our interests at Amgen, is you could have an app that keeps track of your migraine headaches, tells you how you're doing with the molecule, can have graphics built into it so you can share with your physician and see how you're doing in the process. So those are kind of the disease management apps. And I think part of that is also patient support networks where you can build, participate in communities. Novartis has done this, for example, in hives or urticaria, in which they've actually funded a community support system. The other general area is compliance. If you think about compliance, you might think compliance for serious illnesses and illnesses in general is pretty good, but in actuality, compliance is quite poor. About 30 to 40% of people don't actually take the medications as directed. And so if you're not taking your medication, of course, it's not going to be efficacious. So there will be compliance related digital health techniques and approaches being used. And these can be something like AI Cure, which is a company that uses artificial intelligence to look at whether you swallow your pill or not. Proteus, which has a tracking device built into the pills, or something as simple as a text reminder that sends you a text every day and tells you, please take your pill. And then the last category, which I think is probably going to be the most challenging for industry, is a synergistic approach. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean is you can imagine developing a drug which has a digital health component associated with it, which actually is synergistic with the drug so that you get better efficacy out of the drug by having a digital health component. For example, many of you might be aware of the work Sofia Vinogradov has done in schizophrenia, in cognition in schizophrenia, using cognitive remediation, using basically computer software to improve cognition. The thought is that you could combine a pill for cognitive remediation in schizophrenia along with a digital health approach and have it a synergistic process in which each one by itself doesn't do as well as the 2 combined. Mm-hmm. So I think in general, it's not lip service. I think it's where we're going. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is really understanding how we're going to get there.
So we have 2 Davids on the panel. I almost wish someone had a name like mine, but we'll go with Dave in the middle and David over on the end over there. So starting with you, Dave, it's really interesting that you're trying to develop validated digital therapeutics. And I just wanted to go back and quote something that the American Medical Association CEO said last June that ruffled a few feathers, but I kind of feel like they needed to be ruffled. So he talked about from ineffective electronic health records to an explosion of direct-to-consumer digital health products to apps of mixed quality. It's the digital snake oil of the 21st century. Fascinating comment. People privately told me that people who were in the digital health privately told me that he's absolutely right. So I wanted to ask you about this idea that docs are a little bit flummoxed about the lack of data of some of these digital health products. So how important is validation? How important is data, and where do you stand on that?
Sure, and that's a good question. I think since then the AMA has taken somewhat of an about face. We are as a company a bit different. In 2012, we founded the company with a group of neuropsychiatrists, and we're really ex-biotech investors and operators, and in fact coined the term digital therapeutics in 2012, and really applied a very biotech-like model to the development of apps. And we felt digital therapeutics would be basically outcomes-based mobile software, right? So we had a focus on validation from the beginning, and really that we would validate our software just like one would validate a biotech compound. In fact, we just published this morning on one of our smoking cessation trials. And so I think what you're seeing, though, are really kind of, there's so much innovation in the space, and there's so much that technology can actually do to really reshape healthcare, that you're seeing brilliant software engineers and new technologies that are directly applicable to software. And the phone figures out a cool way to whether it's tell your heart rate or figure out your mood, but that innovation might be coming from maybe not healthcare folks, right? They might be coming out of two brilliant engineers from MIT that aren't necessarily thinking, okay, well now we need to run a randomized controlled trial and really prove that this works, right? So I think what you're seeing here is an industry that's getting to be more akin to your traditional kind of large molecule or small molecule pharma model, where people don't really accept products unless there is some clinical validation. So I do see a narrowing of the field into really a place where I believe that it really belongs, and that's, look, you really don't have, products shouldn't make claims around them until you have some type of clinical validation. So I think that's increasingly moving in the right direction.
So David, you said that you sort of began your career in medical devices and in pharma and medical devices. The RCT, as Oren mentioned, is sort of the holy grail. Is there a way that we need to rethink clinical validation and randomized clinical trials when we're dealing with such a new modality of treatment as a digital health product?
Sure, and that's a great question.
That was David.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go.
We were trying
I had a great answer.
David, hey.
We'll let you chime in, David.
Okay, yes. No, thank you for that question. What we're seeing in the digital health space is there are a lot of technologies out there. There are a lot of different solutions that people are building, a lot of different apps. And so there's, as an investor, sometimes it's really hard to figure out what is noise versus what are really quality companies that, we want to be really interested in. And it's now coming to what, Gabriel and Dave's saying is that we have to start to look at the data that's coming out. We have to start to look at the validation. We have to see that, are they actually really supporting the claims that they're making? And I think that, in a way, it's kind of, it's interesting that, you have these early adopters are willing to just take the word for it and try it. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to really get the broad adoption, you're going to need to go through these, validation trials. I mean, clearly, the best way to do it is to do a randomized clinical trial if you can. However, there are a lot of different ways that you could actually get a lot of data without it. One of the nice things about not needing to go to these academic centers to do clinical trials is that with the availability of technology and the broad adoptions that you have already with the iPhone and other mobile technologies, that you could get real-world data, real-world information from everyday activities of individuals that could actually start to give you the mass amount of data. And with the advent of the data analytics, you could actually able to start to capture the real intelligence out of that data. Mm-hmm. So Although I have to, I mean, I would love for every single technology to go through, randomized clinical trials. I think that, there's going to be a time where the information that you get from everyday use, but in a way that is just, you get large volumes of it, and the ability to extract really quality data out of that, it's going to be probably accepted. I know that there's, with the 21st Century Cures Act, that there's starting to get kind of inroads even with the regulatory agency, that they're willing to accept information like that.
Dave.
Sure, thank you. And we had anticipated that might happen and did everything we could to avoid it, but it still happened. So yeah, I'll just augment what David said there, which I think is right on. And the FDA seems to really be clearing a pathway for software as a medical device, right? And we're pursuing that pathway, and for our major depressive disorder product, and it's one that really will require very robust RCTs. So, we actually, and I think it's probably necessary for people who want to go into registration studies and really ultimately have physicians prescribe your technology and get reimbursement. You have to start thinking about about that active control group right from the beginning. So as you're developing your product, and as we develop our products, we're really contemplating and in some senses actually designing and architecting what the active control group would be. So I think probably right from the beginning, and that's one of the challenges in this space are really what are the control groups in the space. And I think building and contemplating and architecting an active control as you're developing your product, especially if you're pursuing a kind of rigorous FDA approved pathway, is a really good idea.
So Gabriel, let's talk about that data for a second. When you're looking to work with entrepreneurs at an early stage, and I'm sure there are innovators here in the audience, what level of data are you looking for? What will satisfy you?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think that that's one of the challenges, because these are early days and many of these entrepreneurs don't have a lot of data that's available. So I think from my perspective, what you have to look at is the technology, does it fit as to what you're trying to do? Is there interest as far as our medications, and would they work well hand in hand? So we have, for example, we have a lot of heart failure programs that we're developing, and we'd like to have activity tracking as part of that. And one of the challenges in activity tracking is, as I'm sure many of you read, if you look at consumer grade activity trackers, there's a lot of differences in the precision of the activity tracking that you have, and the question is how much imprecision can you get away with? So we've taken the approach of looking of simply incorporating devices into our clinical trials early on, and saying we don't think there's enough validation out there. We're just going to look at it ourselves and going to incorporate these devices into our clinical trials and get the data out of it. So we did a small clinical trial late last year, which was really a test of a couple of things. One was we wanted to understand data flow, how to get data off these devices, because that's not that easy to do, because you have to get data off the devices and put it into our own clinical database, and that's not as straightforward as you might imagine. And we wanted to test the idea of using wearable devices in a clinical trial setting. So we used a CRO that specializes in phase 1. And we chose healthy subjects, because what we wanted to test is really data gathering more than anything else. So we used Garmin VivaFit because for a variety of reasons, one of them being that it has a 1-year battery life. And to us, that was really convenient. If we think of going into larger clinical trials, we don't want people to have to recharge the device on every day like you have to do with Apple Watch or something like that. So these are things that are also pragmatic issues that come into play. So anyway, we ran a 2-week trial, 30 healthy subjects. They were outfitted with a Garmin VivaFit 24/7. And we added to that a medical grade device that also did the same thing. So it was a comparison between consumer grade electronic, medical grade device. 2 weeks, 30 subjects, we got 9 billion data points off that trial. 9 billion data points. And that kind of blew our data sciences capability right off the bat. And in comparison, we ran a 30,000 patient cardiology study, which just finished, and that had 40 million data points. So, this is just an amazing amount of data, and so that we have to adjust for and try to figure out how to use it. But to answer your question, I think that what we're looking at is incorporating these devices into our clinical trials early on and get a sense of what kind of data we can get out of it and how easy it is to work with them.
So David, you don't have the luxury that Gabriel has in terms of plug and play into their own clinical trials, and yet you have to make decisions of which technology you want to invest in. So what is your go-to method of looking at these technologies?
Well, you're right. We don't have the luxury of spending money on what would call high-level risk. In this case, clinical trial risk. Depending on how big of an investor you are willing to take certain number of risks. That's something that you can manage, but you're unwilling to take bigger risks. So, for example, I would not take quote-unquote phase 2 or phase 3 trial risk, but I may take certain risks to get me to certain validation points or milestones in a company that makes me feel comfortable to do early stage investing. So just typically what I would do is, for example, a lot of digital health companies, fortunately, do not require a lot of capital to get to where they want to go. They're using a lot of off-the-shelf technologies that they're putting together for their own application. So often, there's very little technology risk that you're taking. Another one is that you have pretty good, I would say, founders who understand domain space really well. I mean, that's one of the things that I look for is, if there's a particular pain point, I hope that you've lived through the pain point, and so that you understand exactly what you're trying to solve. So domain expertise is one thing that I also look for. And then, often on the early stages of the companies are funded by other means. Sometimes we have, founders are so passionate about that space, they would do what's called bootstrapping. They spend their own money to get it to a certain point that there's enough validation. And that's actually really interesting for me to see that if they're so passionate about it, that they're gonna be champions and then stewards of their own capital. And so if I see that as an early stage investor, those are checking off some of the risks that I would see. Then I would be coming in with a financial risk to take them to the next level of validation. And typically, it's not, clinical. I would say it's not that ultimate, randomized clinical trials, but it is to a level that it is. Do we have enough to start working with the bigger strategic partners, or would they be willing to do the proof of concept? And if some of the companies that we've seen have done that early proof of concept with strategic partners, and if they have some positive data, then definitely they're very attractive as an investment. But if I could go back to the overall use of data, one of the nice things about the new technologies that are coming out is even though you may have 9 billion data points, actually that's raw data. There are other technologies that are out there that are doing incredible data analytics that allow you to, again, parse out that 9 billion data points to something that is really more manageable, whether it is actually trends, then you're using the trends more than anything else instead of the raw data points, or it's the learnings from that data. And there are a number of data analytics companies that are focused just on doing things like that.
Okay. Dave, you're developing a product for major depressive disorder. Can you talk about how you approach the validation for that and how you're trying to go to market with it?
Sure. So we've been we have a product, really it's a cognitive emotion control training exercise, and it's essentially dosed 3 times a week over the course of 6 weeks for about 10 or 15 minutes. And really we're seeing in now 2 randomized controlled trials against an active control group, which consisted of really working memory. So it's a very, very strong active control group. We're seeing over 40% decrease in symptoms of MDD on average against a control group, which is really around 15%. So much more of a separation there than you would even see in a drug study where placebo, sugar pills have extremely high effect. So really, it's I would say a golden age for this era and for digital therapeutics. you're seeing a pathway really seemingly open up to get these approved and de novo classifications as Class 2 medical devices for the treatment of certain diseases, right? So you're talking about actual labeling on these software programs. And we're seizing the moment, if you will, and pursuing that pathway. After 2 randomized controlled trials, we're now in the process of designing a registration study, and we'll have what's called a pre-submission meeting with the FDA in the next few months to propose and get feedback on that registration trial. But really, taking a somewhat, it's interesting because the actual pathway is a medical device pathway, but the end product, it looks more like a drug in terms it's prescribed and drives outcomes. So you're seeing a really kind of regulatory friendly environment for these kind of products, and frankly, that's what seems to be needed to get widespread reimbursement. And we strongly feel these products belong in the doctor's office and should be prescribed, whether it's alongside a traditional pharmacotherapy or in fact in lieu of one. And we see a lot of opportunity in depression and insomnia to actually have software prescribed as first-line treatments instead of pharmacotherapies.
So the next question is for whoever's the bravest on the panel, and for Gabriel if he wants to badmouth his competitors. So are there some pharma companies that are more cutting edge in terms of adoption of digital health than others? No.
Yes, I think, so I've been to a lot of digital health conferences, you might imagine, the last couple of years. I think there's a almost bell-shaped curve, if you will, of people getting into digital health. I think my company probably is somewhere in the middle. We're not at the front, we're not too far behind either. But I think there are other companies that are a little bit further ahead. I think Novartis is a good example. I think they've done quite a bit of work with, for example, cardiology, in which Entresto, that they're looking at digital health component to it. At the end of the day, I think everybody realizes this is the way to go. I think if you look at all companies, they will look and say, yes, this is the way to go. We're not quite sure how to get there. There's this concept of being a fast follower. Right? And the concept is that you let other people do the work, and then you figure out what works, and then you follow as quickly as possible. So the upside of that is that you've taken some of the risk out of the equation because you're following what has worked. The challenge behind it, of course, is you're behind the competition. They're already incorporating these devices into their molecules and going beyond the molecule, and so you are behind them. And so I think that's a competitive issue because I do think all molecules will be at one point packaged with some digital health apparatus, because that will be what will be expected of people. If you look at how many billions of smartphones are around the world, and the fact that the younger you are, the more likely you are to use the smartphone. So there will be a generation, their 20s and 30s and 40s, that grew up using smartphones, and they expect everything to be done with that. So adding a smartphone app to your medication is going to be just standard. And so I think that's the way we have to go. It depends on your strategy of how to get there.
Okay, so when, not if, is basically what you're saying in terms of when, not if, in terms of adoption.
Yes.
So for the less brave on the panel, is there a way? How do you, when you look at pharma and how they're adopting, what do they have to do beyond hiring someone as head of digital health?
Yeah, so I'm going to give a plug for Astellas because they're the funder of the investment vehicle that I'm managing. So, but I think that I can make this a generalized comment to all of pharma. Perhaps even a little less for biotech, but definitely for pharma. Is that I think by nature the players in this space are very conservative. They're going to need more than just glitz and information to say, hey, we're going to really do this. I think it literally has to go with almost a culture of the company themselves. Definitely it starts from the high. If the leadership hasn't bought into it yet, it's not going to filter down to the individual business units. The leadership has to really state that, okay, we are going to integrate digital health as an important part of our strategy and move forward with it. And then have more of a comprehensive type of strategy, because you can't have mismatch of different things that are trying to do different things. I mean, so many of the big pharma are multinational, global, with a lot of different units. And I think the important part is everyone is on the same page to do that. Then after that, it's about understanding what digital health is, because pharma is an expert on how to getting a drug to an approved product and selling it. I think more and more now they're experts on marketing and selling the drugs and less about development. But that's what they know and what they do really well. Now trying to integrate new type of technology and new type of actually mindset to actually how you develop and then ultimately sell, it's going to take people to be more receptive and understand that, this is where things are going to go, and we have to work actively to do it instead of kind of being pulled along. Okay. And I think that, it's getting there, but it's not going quickly. I think as, Amgen, I would say actually it's more on the frontier side than it is in the middle of the road. But I've seen a number of, other players who are just, saying that they would do it, but in reality, underneath, culturally, they're not there yet.
They're not there. Okay. So we talked a lot about data and validation. I want to talk a little bit about data sharing, which seems to be the real block in terms of, empowering researchers and patients to fully make use of the products that they're using. So how do you look at data sharing? It seems like, large companies like I can tell you, Medtronic, for instance, really believes in the value of data. They're working with IBM Watson to do predictive analytics by using data collected from their insulin pumps, but they are not uploading that data onto the IBM Watson cloud, which is sad for other people in diabetes. So in behavioral health, in what you're doing every day, how important is sharing of data? Anyone?
The meeting. So I took a break from investing and then spent 4 years at a healthcare software company in which we took large amounts of data and found, ultimately a predictive analytics tool. But part of that, we had to look through about 60 million clinical lives of EMR data. And from there, we're finding inferences and models to predict, future chronic disease events. And I would say that, especially in the era of digital health, that's one of the key things that you have to know. In fact, one of my colleagues, he's a data scientist, because for us to make an investment in the space, we really needed to understand not only do you have access to data, but how good is the data, and what can you do with it, and what can you learn from it. I mean, especially in pharma, they have so much data. I would ask the question, what are you doing with your own data? And not only getting access to new data, but what are you doing with your own data? And it's not the information coming out of new products, but if you've done clinical trials, what are you doing with the clinical trial data and all of the the learnings you got from it? Is it being shared within the actual company itself? And I bet you for most pharma, the answer is no. I bet you it's been pretty siloed already, and that it hasn't been even shared. And so I think the mindset is there that people want to look at data and use data, but I don't think it's there yet. And part of it has to do with, kind of, well, we've always done it this way, so why should we start to change? And again, changes are going to come, but it has to be driven right now. And but right now there are a lot of different technologies that people could use to take new data and do something really interesting with it. And it's available, but it's that, are you ready to actually use it?
So Gabriel, how do you use data?
So I agree with David. I think we have a lot of data that we've captured from our own clinical trials, which are actually siloed. A couple of years ago, I was looking at, we were developing a new drug, and we were getting an adverse event in our clinical trials, and we were asking the question: is this something that you would expect to see at a certain percentage in a healthy population? It might be just what you would expect to see. And we could not get access to the rest of the data that we've done, even though we've done thousands, because we didn't have an easy way of accessing data. So having, that's within our own company. So you can imagine the challenge going outside of the company. So it would be great to be able to have a pre-competitive kind of arena where you actually share a lot of this data from clinical trials. Even if all you're sharing is placebo, right? I mean, all of us run big chunks of our clinical trials are placebo. And we can look at baseline, data for placebo and how that changes. But the other thing is, getting back to digital health, is you could imagine have pre-competitive space, as you could actually go through the validation process of a lot of these devices. Is why does every company have to do that individually? Why couldn't we just team up together and say, we'd like to understand which is the best consumer-grade activity tracker, and put Fitbit there, Garmin, and whatever else you want to look at.
Right.
And you have a consortium, and you get the data out, and you analyze it. Okay, this is the best in these circumstances, and this is, it's reliable data, captures your heart rate, captures your steps, whatever. The other component, I think, in data that's really important for digital health is capturing new clinical endpoints. So we're going to be using digital health devices, and you can imagine a use case is activity tracking. Again, I'm picking it out because it's pretty simple, and you can use a consumer-grade wearable and have it as an exploratory endpoint, which at the end of the day, you can use it with payers and demonstrate that your drug has an effect on the activity level, and payers might be interested in that. But the holy grail, the way I see it, is to take digital health devices and develop new clinical endpoints, which are more objective and can be adopted for pivotal trials where it's not an exploratory endpoint, but it's actually your primary endpoint. Okay. So instead of having, for example, the 6-minute walk test is a traditional, very well understood regulatory endpoint for a lot of diseases, Parkinson's disease, pulmonary diseases, in which you have a patient walk for 6 minutes and basically time them and you observe them. And you can imagine, instead of having that really old-fashioned assessment, could you have assessment at home where you have sensors and trackers that give you real-world data of how the patient is doing at home, which at the end of the day is what we're really interested in. Absolutely. Right? And if you could actually get that data and developed it such a way that the FDA is fine and comfortable with taking those data, I think that would be a huge step forward.
Right.
So we talked about pharma and biotech and whether they're embracing with open arms or being a little more circumspect. How about physicians and providers? The thing that I hear a lot is, oh, all this technology is great, but it needs to fit into the clinical workflow. I mean, that to them is like the gold standard. So to both the Davids, how do you bring about cultural change amidst health systems and providers? And that's a tough one.
Sure. Yeah, that is a tough one, and I would just say kind of perseverance pays off, right? And really, what our business model really is not a direct one, where we're not creating entirely new networks of providers and so on and so forth. We're partnering with payers and providers on one side, and on pharma on the other. So we're really sliding into established distribution channels and companies who really have those relationships. Now, I think just to go back to where this conversation started, clinically validating these technologies is critical. And really, when you create a new digital therapeutic, which essentially is new medicine, at all times you have to keep in mind, I mean, this is not something that can make the doctor's life harder. And we were just talking about this earlier. I mean, it just has to be something that is easy for the doctor to use, and that is a simpler, more efficient and quicker process. I think what you're seeing in this, what I would liken to a kind of revolution, where just like there was a biotech and kind of large molecule revolution, and those gained acceptance and those got integrated with pharma and so on. I think that you're seeing it here, and I think that this pathway of really software as a medical device, and to get these products approved by the FDA, and to have that stamp, and to have that barrier to entry, if you will, and to get reimbursement, those are all steps in the right direction. And I think ultimately in the next year or two, you're going to start seeing doctors prescribe software programs to patients, and those patients are going to come back and say, wow, that was really helpful, and so on and so forth, and then that'll spread more and more. So I think it's going to be a bit organic, but I really do believe we're on the cusp of a massive revolution here in this space, and these products are about to start competing with pharmaceuticals. So not just as kind of marketing tools that help drive compliance and can help drive outcomes, but actually products that are prescribed in lieu of a pharmaceutical. And so I think you're about to see major backing from pharma and from other types of groups like that will educate doctors. They have huge, medical education divisions and so on and so forth. So I think we're really right on the cusp of a major revolution where doctors will be prescribing these software, and that'll grow very, very fast.
So on that super positive note, I wanted to open it up for Q&A. We have about 9 minutes or so left. So anyone in the audience that would like to come up? I think we have some floating mics. Come on, don't be shy.
Hi, my name's Megan. I'm here with Stride Health. We help people get access to health insurance. People will call us and say, how can I use my insurance coverage to do X, Y, and Z? So to add on to your question about how to change the culture with clinicians, how do you see changing the culture with patients being open to trying digital therapeutics?
So let me tackle that one. And I may end up with my thoughts about how to change the ideas of clinicians. But for patients, it's largely about acting two things. One is ease of use. They want to do something that makes their lives easier. Okay. The other one is that it doesn't cost them anything. When I look at investments and someone tells me, well, it's going to be direct to consumer, I start to cringe because I find that that business model is really difficult. You either hit a home run or it's going to be really tough to generate revenues because consumers as a group, they don't really spend as much as you think they do. Something that they really think that they need, they may do it. But overall, if you look at all the apps out there, they're willing to pay $1, $5, maybe $10 for an app, but on a continual basis, if they see that they're spending in the hundreds, they're going to start to feel, oh, okay, if it's out of their own pockets. Mm-hmm. So often I look at the business model and I look for those business models that are more to B2B and that ultimately be used by consumers, but it's paid by another organization, like a business. So that makes a lot more sense. In regards to the physicians, and again, I'm going to sound really cynical, but the other thing I do is I follow the money. I mean, if the physicians are ultimately either making money or it's costing them less to do the right thing, they will be more likely to adopt it. If you're going to make them pay for something or make them spend extra time using it, the likelihood of adoption is pretty low. Even if they are philosophically champions of that particular therapy, them actually adopting it is fairly low. And unfortunately, that's kind of how the whole system is run, is you have to see what the alignment is. And a lot of it is fiscal alignment. If you're going to make the life of a physician harder by saying that now I'm going to give you reams of data that you need to look at in my 15 minutes so that I could get the right answer from you, it's going to be really hard for them to buy that type of technology. You have to make the lives of the people who are actually going to use it much easier. And ultimately, for them, hopefully they could make more money doing it.
It's really important you mentioned that because we've not really talked about the issue of reimbursement of digital tech. And that's, I think, the biggest 800-pound gorilla in the room. How do you approach payers to pay for these types of products? Because I think, as you mentioned, if physicians are getting paid for it, they'd probably be more open.
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that payers actually are the best customers because ultimately they are at risk, meaning that they have dollars at risk. If they could find a way to definitely maintain the same level of care, if not improve it, but it costs them less to deliver it, they're very interested. You have to show them that you could do it, but they're very interested. And this is where I would say that a lot of these ideas that improve workflow, that find errors in systems or anomalies. One of the areas that we were interested in is how do you use big data to find these, situations where there are anomalies that could potentially save the risk-bearing entities money, or how do you create a situation where you provide better care, so in the long run they could actually do better. Especially, when incentives are that if you have to meet certain quality measures and you help them to meet them quality measures, because if you don't do that, you either get a penalty or you don't get your bonus. Then they're very incentivized to actually, do those behaviors that allow them to do better. But, again, being the cynical person, usually it's like they're doing it because it allows them to make more money or, decrease cost.
Okay, got it. Any more views on the panel on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that. I think with the kind of innovation that you're seeing in digital health, you're seeing innovation in payment models. We're going out, for example, with our smoking cessation solution in an outcomes-based pricing model. So, payers don't pay unless people quit. So it's essentially a pay per quarter model. So you are seeing a shift from this traditional PM, per member, per month type model to an outcomes-based model. And I would encourage people to embrace that model. It makes sense for everyone. It makes sense for companies like ours. It makes sense for the payers. And it makes sense ultimately for the patient who are afforded with more effective and efficient treatments.
And that's the overall trend in healthcare anyway. They pay for performance, whether you're digital health or you're a medical device or pharma. Any other questions from the audience?
Hi there, my name's Lila Taylor and I'm here with Demi Colton. And my question is often with mental health treatment, therapy is paired with medication as part of the treatment. Do any of you see digital mental health being required as part of a treatment program? So it's something that would be necessary to, as part of the program, not optional or secondary, but something that is a working pair?
So I could talk to that for a second. I mean, and I would say absolutely. I mean, I would keep in mind that a lot of these things are indicated already with behavioral health, right? So I mean, look at, even whether it's depression or smoking. Look at smoking, for example. Some things like Chantix, even nicotine replacement therapy, so the gum, the lozenge, the patch. These things are indicated with behavioral health management, right? They're just not being utilized. So I would say that, yeah, I see these things as absolutely being required in that sense. And I also see, and we have experience now that we're getting with insurers really putting these as kind of step-up type therapies. Hey, why don't you try this before you go on this medication for years? So I would say that not only in conjunction, but you're seeing formularies really starting to look at this space as hey, maybe we should add in as a step up. So
if I could add to that, in my former life, I actually was a practicing internist, and when you practice medicine, there are certain things that you do because it's well accepted in the community, but it takes a long time to get accepted in the community. It starts with good clinical data to support why you would want to use this digital health therapy in conjunction with medication. So you need to prove that out. Then it usually goes through the society, and then it gets populated. Now, this process of getting adopted will be accelerated if there are means such as control of the formulary, or there's I'm not going to cite Kaiser, where you have the provider network and the physicians actually working very closely together, and they could change policies really quickly. And so when you communicate that policy, then it gets quickly changed within the Kaiser community. But unless you have that acceleration, it will slowly get permeated throughout. But it all starts with the data. If you have, again, data to say that this is the way things has to be done, then it will start to be accepted.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, to add to that, it basically follows the initial comment I made, which is I think if you have synergism in which you can combine your drug with your digital health application and show that that is actually superior, then that eventually, if you have enough data, will come out as kind of a standard of care.
I think we're almost out of time, so I want to thank the panel for an interesting discussion and hope you have learned more throughout the day today.
Thank you. Thanks.